I remember the exact moment he walked into my courtroom, and even now, years of experience sitting behind that bench did not prepare me for the sheer weight of arrogance that entered with him, the kind that fills the air before a storm, the kind that presses against your chest and makes the room feel smaller, heavier, almost suffocating, and I watched him carefully, slowly lifting my eyes from the case file as the double doors opened with a soft echo. And there he was, dressed in a suit so immaculate it looked like it had never known a wrinkle, a deep charcoal fabric that reflected the overhead lights in subtle waves, cufflinks catching glints like tiny mirrors, shoes polished to the point where they almost seemed to glow. And yet it wasn't the clothing that drew my attention. No, it was the way he walked, the deliberate slowness, the slight tilt of his chin upward, the faint smirk resting on his lips as though the entire courtroom existed merely as a stage for his performance. And I felt something stir within me, not anger yet, but recognition, because I have seen men like him before, men who believe money can bend reality, men who mistake power for immunity. And as he approached the defendant's table, not once did he glance toward the bench, not once did he acknowledge the authority of the court, and that more than anything else told me exactly what kind of man I was about to deal with. I watched as he took his seat, slowly, deliberately, crossing one leg over the other with the ease of someone sitting in his own private office rather than a courtroom where lives change in a single sentence. And I noted the way his lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, something cautionary, but the man simply waved him off with a subtle flick of his fingers, as though swatting away an inconvenience. And I felt my jaw tighten ever so slightly, a movement so small no one in the room would notice. But inside, I was already forming my judgment of his character. Not the legal judgment. No, that would come later. But the human judgment. The understanding of who he was beneath the tailored suit and the polished shoes. And I opened the case file slowly, letting the silence stretch, letting the room settle into that heavy, anticipatory stillness that only a courtroom can hold. And I spoke his name, calmly, evenly, letting each syllable carry weight. And when he finally looked up at me, finally acknowledged my presence, there was no respect in his eyes, only curiosity, as though he were assessing me, measuring me, deciding how much I was worth in his world, and that more than anything ignited a quiet fire within me. I remember thinking, as I began to read through the initial details, that this case would not be simple, not because of its legal complexity, but because of the man sitting before me, because men like him do not see consequences, they see obstacles, and obstacles in their world are meant to be removed, bypassed, or bought. And as I turned each page, the weight of the allegations settled deeper into my chest. Financial manipulation, coercion, exploitation of vulnerable individuals, and beneath it all, a pattern, a clear, undeniable pattern of behavior that spoke not of a single mistake, but of a mindset, a belief system rooted in entitlement and reinforced by years of unchecked success. And I paused just briefly, letting the silence stretch again, letting him feel it, letting everyone feel it, because silence in a courtroom is never empty. It is filled with expectation, with tension, with the unspoken understanding that something important is about to unfold. And I lifted my gaze once more, meeting his eyes directly, holding that gaze just a second longer than necessary. And I could see it, the faint flicker of annoyance, the slightest shift in his posture. And I knew then this would not be a quiet proceeding. As the prosecution began outlining the case, I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the tone, the pacing, the subtle shifts in emphasis that reveal more than any document ever could. And I watched the defendant as well, because in my courtroom, I do not simply hear cases, I observe them, I absorb them, I read the room as much as I read the law. And he sat there, relaxed, almost bored, occasionally glancing at his watch, occasionally exchanging whispers with his lawyer. And I felt a slow, controlled anger begin to build within me, not the kind that erupts, but the kind that simmers, that sharpens focus, that reminds me why I chose this profession in the first place, because justice is not about convenience. It is not about wealth or status. It is about accountability. And as the details of his actions began to unfold, each more troubling than the last, I found myself leaning forward ever so slightly, my fingers resting against the bench, grounding myself in the reality of the moment, reminding myself that no matter who sat before me, no matter how powerful they believed themselves to be, in this courtroom, there is only one authority that matters. The backstory as it emerged was as intricate as it was disturbing, a web of transactions, agreements, and manipulations that spanned months, even years, each step calculated, each move designed to benefit him at the expense of others. And I listened as the prosecution described how he had identified his target, a small business owner, hardworking, honest, struggling to keep afloat in a competitive market, and how he had approached with promises, with opportunities, with what seemed like a lifeline, only to slowly tighten the grip, to introduce clauses, conditions, pressures that the victim had neither the resources nor the experience to fully understand. And I watched the defendant as these details were presented, and there was no sign of discomfort, no flicker of regret, only that same faint smirk, as though he were listening to a story that had nothing to do with him, and I felt my patience being tested, not by the case itself, but by his complete and utter lack of awareness, or perhaps, more accurately, his complete disregard for the consequences of his actions. The victim's story began to take shape piece by piece, each detail adding another layer to the narrative, and I found myself leaning into the words, listening not just as a judge, but as a human being, because beneath the legal terminology, beneath the contracts and the numbers, there was a person, a life disrupted, a future altered, and I could see it in the way the victim sat in the courtroom, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped tightly together, eyes fixed on the floor as though looking anywhere else would be too much to bear. And I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest, the weight of responsibility, the understanding that what I would decide in this room would ripple outward, affecting not just the defendant, but everyone involved. And I glanced again at the man in the tailored suit, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he even saw the person sitting across from him, or if, in his world, people were merely variables in an equation designed to maximize his gain. Then came the moment that shifted everything, the moment that transformed this from a serious case into something far more profound. And I remember it with absolute clarity because it happened so quickly. And yet it felt as though time itself slowed, stretching the seconds into something almost tangible. And it began with a simple gesture, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention. But I was watching. I was always watching. And I saw his hand move, reaching into his jacket, and I saw the slight exchange between him and his lawyer, the hesitation, the whispered protest. And then, without any regard for the setting, without any understanding of the line he was about to cross, he placed an envelope on the table, sliding it forward just enough for it to be visible, and he looked up at me, meeting my eyes with a confidence that bordered on audacity. And in a low, measured voice, he spoke words that echoed in my mind long after they were said. He did not shout. He did not make a scene. No, that would have been too crude for a man like him. Instead, he spoke quietly, almost casually, as though discussing a business transaction rather than attempting to corrupt the very foundation of the justice system. And he said, "Perhaps we can resolve this efficiently." And he tapped the envelope lightly with his fingers, a gesture so deliberate, so calculated, that it left no room for misinterpretation. And in that moment, I felt something shift within me, something firm, something unyielding. And I straightened in my seat, my expression hardening, my voice when I spoke, carrying a weight that silenced the room instantly. I have seen many things in my courtroom. I have witnessed lies, manipulation, desperation, even violence. But there are lines that must never be crossed. And what he had just done was not just an insult to me, it was an insult to the entire system, to every person who has ever stood in that room seeking justice. And I leaned forward slightly, my gaze fixed on him, and I said slowly, clearly, "Did you just attempt to bribe this court?" And the silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Every eye in the room shifting between us, waiting, watching. And for the first time since he had entered, I saw something in his expression change, just slightly, just enough to reveal that perhaps, just perhaps, he had miscalculated. The next 10 seconds unfolded with a precision that only comes from years of experience. And I remember each one as though it were etched into my memory. Because in those 10 seconds, everything changed for him, everything. And I raised my hand, signaling to the bailiff, my voice firm, unwavering. "Bailiff, take him into custody." And the reaction was immediate, the room erupting into murmurs, his lawyer standing abruptly, protesting, the defendant himself rising halfway from his seat, shock flashing across his face as reality began to catch up with him. And I watched, calmly, as the bailiff moved forward, placing a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back down, securing his wrists. And for the first time, the arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw, something real, something that money could not erase. As he was led away, the envelope still sitting on the table, untouched, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of clarity. The kind that comes when you know without a doubt that you have done exactly what needed to be done. And I looked out over the courtroom, over the faces of those who had witnessed the moment. And I spoke, not just to them, but to anyone who would ever hear of this case, my voice steady, my words deliberate. In this courtroom, justice is not for sale. And I paused, letting the words settle, letting their meaning take hold. Not for $100,000, not for $1 million, not for any amount. And I leaned back slightly, my gaze returning to the empty space where he had been sitting just moments before, and I added quietly, but with absolute certainty, because the moment justice has a price, it is no longer justice. I remember the silence that followed his removal, the kind of silence that does not merely fill a room but grips it, tightens around every breath, presses against every chest. And I sat there, unmoving, allowing that silence to linger because it needed to, because moments like this must not be rushed, must not be diluted, and I watched as the courtroom slowly recalibrated itself, the murmurs fading, the shifting bodies settling back into place, and yet something had changed, something fundamental, because everyone present had just witnessed a line being drawn, not in words, but in action. And I lowered my gaze briefly to the envelope still resting on the table, untouched, its presence now heavier than before, almost symbolic. And I thought to myself how many times men like him had succeeded in other rooms, how many doors had opened, how many rules had bent, and I felt a quiet resolve settle deeper within me, a reminder that this bench is not merely a seat, it is a responsibility, and I would not allow it to be diminished. When proceedings resumed, I made it clear that the case would continue, that his attempt to derail the process would not grant him escape, and I spoke with measured control, each word deliberate, each pause intentional, and I could see the shift in the room, the renewed focus, the understanding that what had just occurred was not the end, but merely another layer of the truth being revealed. And as the bailiff returned, confirming the defendant was secured, I nodded once, acknowledging the action without ceremony, and instructed that the record reflect exactly what had taken place, because transparency is the backbone of justice, and I would not allow any ambiguity to exist, not in my courtroom, not under my authority. The victim, who had remained seated through the chaos, now lifted their gaze slightly, and I noticed the subtle change in their posture, the way their shoulders seemed just a fraction less burdened. And I felt something shift within me, a quiet acknowledgement that for them, this moment mattered in ways that extended far beyond the legal outcome, because for so long, they had been at the mercy of someone who believed himself untouchable. And now, in a matter of seconds, that illusion had shattered, and I allowed my voice to soften, just slightly as I addressed them, encouraging them to continue, to speak, to let their truth be heard fully, because their voice deserved space, deserved weight, deserved to exist without interruption or intimidation. Their testimony unfolded slowly, painfully, each word carrying the weight of lived experience, and I listened intently, not interrupting, not rushing, allowing the pauses, the hesitations, the moments where emotion threatened to overtake composure. Because those moments matter, they reveal truth in a way no document ever can, and I could see the impact of the defendant's actions etched into their expressions, the exhaustion, the frustration, the quiet resilience that comes from enduring more than one should ever have to, and I felt my grip tighten slightly against the edge of the bench, grounding myself, reminding myself that my role is not to react, but to absorb, to understand, to ensure that every detail is considered with the gravity it deserves. Meanwhile, in holding, the man who had once walked into my courtroom with such confidence was now facing a reality he had clearly never anticipated. And though he was not physically present before me, his absence was felt, a stark contrast to the dominance he had attempted to assert earlier. And I thought about the psychology of men like him, how power becomes a shield, how wealth becomes a language they expect everyone else to understand. And I wondered briefly what he was thinking in that moment, whether the weight of consequence had begun to settle in, whether the certainty he once carried had started to fracture. And I knew that when he returned, when he faced this courtroom again, he would not be the same man who had walked in. As the prosecution continued, they introduced further evidence, documents, communications, patterns that painted an increasingly clear picture, and I followed each thread carefully, connecting the dots, ensuring that nothing was overlooked, because cases like this are not about a single action. They are about patterns, about intent, about understanding the full scope of behavior, and I ask questions when necessary, precise, focused, cutting through any ambiguity, and each answer only reinforced what had already begun to take shape in my mind. A narrative of calculated exploitation, of deliberate choices made with full awareness of their impact. When the defense finally spoke, it was with a noticeably different tone. The earlier confidence replaced with caution, with an almost palpable tension. And I observed closely, noting the shift, the subtle adjustments in language, the careful phrasing designed to minimize, to reframe, to salvage what could still be salvaged. And yet, beneath it all, there was an acknowledgement, unspoken but evident, that the ground beneath them had shifted, that the strategy they had relied upon had been disrupted. And I listened, allowing them their space, because fairness demands that every side be heard, even when the truth seems clear. Hours passed, and the weight of the case grew heavier, not lighter, because with each piece of information, each testimony, each clarification, the reality became more undeniable. And I found myself reflecting on my years on the bench, on the countless individuals who had stood before me, each with their own stories, their own justifications, their own attempts to shape reality to their advantage. And I realized once again that justice is not about perfection. It is about clarity, about seeing through the noise, through the performance, to the core of what has truly occurred. When he was finally brought back into the courtroom, escorted, restrained, the contrast was undeniable. And I watched him closely as he took his seat once more, his movements no longer slow and deliberate, but measured, cautious. And for the first time, he looked at me not with curiosity, not with arrogance, but with something else, something that resembled uncertainty. And I held his gaze, steady, unflinching, allowing him to feel the full weight of where he stood, of what he had done, of what was to come. I began my address slowly, deliberately, allowing each word to land with precision. And I spoke not just of the legal aspects of the case, but of the broader implications, of the choices he had made, of the mindset that had led him to believe that he could manipulate not only individuals, but the system itself. And my voice, though controlled, carried an unmistakable intensity, the kind that does not need volume to command attention. And I made it clear that what he had attempted was not just illegal, but fundamentally corrosive to the very concept of justice. As I moved toward sentencing, I felt the culmination of everything that had unfolded, every detail, every moment, every choice, and I allowed myself a brief pause, a breath, a moment to ensure that what I would say next carried the full weight it deserved. And then I spoke, firmly, clearly, outlining the consequences, not rushed, not softened, but delivered with absolute certainty, because this was not a moment for hesitation, this was a moment for truth. His reaction was immediate, visceral, the realization hitting him in waves, shock giving way to disbelief, disbelief giving way to fear. And I watched as the composure he had once worn like armor began to crumble, piece by piece, and he spoke, attempting to interrupt, to plead, to reassert some semblance of control. But I did not allow it. I raised my hand, silencing him, my voice cutting through his words with a single command, "Enough," and the room fell silent once more. The sentence was final, comprehensive, leaving no room for ambiguity, and as the bailiff stepped forward once again, I observed the transformation in him, the man who had once believed himself untouchable, now reduced to someone confronting the reality of consequence. And as he was led away, his protests fading, his resistance diminishing, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a steady, unwavering sense of duty fulfilled. Months later, I would think back to that case, to that moment, to the lessons it carried, and I would see its impact, not just in the legal outcome, but in the lives it touched, the victim beginning to rebuild, to find stability once more, and the defendant, now removed from the world he once controlled, facing a reality shaped not by wealth, but by accountability. And as I sit here, reflecting, I am reminded of something I have always known, something that cases like this only reinforce, that power without integrity is nothing more than an illusion, fragile, temporary, and destined to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Because in the end, no matter how much money one has, no matter how high they rise, there is one truth that remains constant, unshaken, unbreakable. Justice does not bow to wealth, it stands above it.